not the worst, but the average Hispanic or black kid is going to a school that's just not performing, the odds are we're not going to do a good job of training that kid.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
We go to the House of Representatives. Morning hour begins.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., March 31st, 2011. I hereby appoint the Honorable Virginia Foxx to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 5, 2011, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, when the President ordered the attack on Libya without congressional authorization, he crossed a very bright constitutional line that he himself recognized in 2007 when he told the Boston Globe, quote, "The President does not have power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation," unquote. The reason the American founders reserved the question of war to the Congress was that they wanted to assure that so momentous a decision could not be made by a single individual. They had watched European kings plunge their nations into bloody and debilitating wars over centuries, and they wanted to avoid that terrible fate for the American Republic. The most fatal and consequential decision that a nation can make is to go to war. And the American founders wanted that decision made by all the representatives of the people after careful deliberation. Only when Congress has made that fateful decision does it fall to the President as Commander-in-Chief to command our armed forces in that war. The authors of the Constitution were explicit on this point. In Federalist 69, Alexander Hamilton drew a sharp distinction between the American President's authority as Commander-in-Chief, which he said would, quote, "amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces," and that of the British King, who could actually declare a war. To contend that the President has the legal authority to commit an act of war without congressional approval requires ignoring every word the Constitution's authors said on this subject, and they said quite a lot. There seems to be a widespread misconception that under the War Powers Act, the President may order any attack on any country he wants for 60 days without congressional approval. That is completely false. The War Powers Act is clear and unambiguous. The President may only order our armed forces into hostilities under 3 very specific conditions, quoting directly from the Act. 1, a declaration of war. 2, specific statutory authority. Or 3, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces, unquote. Only if one of these conditions is present can the President then invoke the War Powers Act. None are present, none are alleged to have been present, and thus the President is in direct violation of that act. The United Nations Participation Act requires specific congressional authorization before American forces are ordered into hostilities in United Nations actions. The North Atlantic Treaty clearly requires troops under NATO command to be deployed in accordance with their own country's constitutional provisions. The War Powers Act specifically forbids inferring from any treaty the power to order American forces into hostilities without specific congressional authorization. The only conclusion that we can make is that this was an illegal and unconstitutional act of the highest significance. The President has implied that he didn't have the time for congressional authorization to avert a humanitarian disaster in Libya. Well, he had plenty of time to get a resolution from the United Nations, and I would remind him that just a day after the unprovoked bombing of Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt appeared in this very chamber to request and receive congressional authorizations. Some have said that the President can do whatever he wishes and that Congress's authority is limited to cutting off funds. Well, war is not a one-sided act that can be turned on and off with congressional funding. Once any nation commits an act of war against another, from that moment on, it is at war. It is inextricably embroiled and entangled with an aggrieved and belligerent party that has casus belli to prosecute hostilities regardless of what the Congress then decides. Finally, I've heard it said, well, we did the same thing in Kosovo. Well, if that is the case, then shame on the Congress that tolerated it. And shame on us if we allow this act to stand unchallenged any longer. This matter strikes at the heart of our Constitution. If this act is allowed to stand, it will fundamentally change the entire character of the legislative and executive functions on the most momentous decision that any nation can make. And it will take us down a dark and bloody road that the American founders fought so hard to avoid. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch,
Thank
for
you,
5
Madam
minutes.
Speaker. Today I intend to use my 5 minutes to talk about the budget crisis that is before Congress. We have to make a decision whether to continue the operations of government. That's the debate that is now underway with a continuing resolution. And we soon face the question of whether or not Congress will extend the debt limit. Now, let me start by acknowledging the obvious. America has to get its fiscal house in order. How we got here is debated, but certain things are indisputable. We have 2 wars that have been paid for on the credit card. We had tax cuts that went to the high-income Americans that are on the credit card. We recently extended them at the cost of $700 billion to the deficit. We had irresponsible behavior on the part of Wall Street that required rescuing the financial system in America so that Main Street could fight and survive another day. And then that led to a collapse in the economy and 10% unemployment that required governmental action in order to try to stabilize the economy. We have a long way to go in restoring the economy, but that has to be our first mission. The Republican proposal on how to address this budget in these continuing resolutions will fail. And the reason it will fail is because it fails to do what must obviously be done if we're going to have long-term fiscal stability, and that is put everything on the table. The cuts that are proposed by the Republican majority, unwise as they are, cannot do the job. The total focus of the Republican effort in its budget plan to restore fiscal balance is to attack 12.5% of the budget, the non-defense discretionary portion of the budget. It happens to be programs that are benefiting Americans in many cases. But leaving aside the debate about whether we should cut low-income heating assistance to the most vulnerable Americans or cut Pell scholarships that allow aspiring young people to enter the middle class, we could cut the entire non-discretionary, discretionary non-defense portion of the budget, and we would continue to have an annual deficit of $1 trillion. So if we're going to get to budget balance and fiscal stability, which we can do, we have to put everything on the table, and that means tax expenditures, the tax breaks that have been written into the tax code over the years by Republicans and Democrats alike actually cost taxpayers more than the entire appropriations budget. And many of us are asking the question, why is it that we are going to be continuing $55 billion in tax breaks to very profitable oil companies when oil is now selling at $106 a barrel? Why are we doing that, allowing that, but at the same time cutting low-income heating assistance and turning down the thermostat of cold Vermonters and cold Americans? Why is it that hedge fund millionaires and billionaires literally pay a lower tax rate than their chauffeurs, their drivers, their cooks, their secretaries. We've got to put tax expenditures on the table. We have to put the defense budget on the table. How is it that America is spending over $700 billion a year? How is it that we are putting 2 wars on the credit card and not facing the fiscal responsibility to tell Americans how we are going to pay for that? But it is simply putting that burden on generations of Americans that will come after us. We have to reform health care. The first act of this Congress was to repeal the health care bill, and debate as we might about what's the best way forward on health care. No one can dispute that our first goal has to be to bring down the cost of health care, because whatever kind of system we have, if the cost is increasing 2 and 3 and 4 times the rate of inflation, job growth, and profits, it's not sustainable. And the health care bill that has been repealed by this Congress, this House of Representatives, that is going to add over $200 billion to the deficit over 10 years. So we have to put everything on the table. That's defense. That's tax expenditures. That's entitlements and how we can reform them so we can maintain benefits, not slash benefits. And Democrats have to be willing to come to the table on the traditional light items in the appropriations bill that where we have to kick the tires and find ways to be responsible. If we do that, by putting everything on the table, we have a chance to be successful and be on a path to fiscal stability and solvency. Refusing to put everything on the table guarantees failure.
Time has expired.
I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, Congressman Sylvester Reyes and I would like to take this opportunity to honor General George W. Casey, Jr., the 36th Chief of Staff of the United States Army, for his extraordinary dedication to duty and service to our nation. As co-chairs of the House Army Caucus, Congressman Reyes and I have had the privilege of working with General Casey as he led our Army through a difficult period of transformation, simultaneously rebalancing and modernizing the Army while our nation was engaged in 2 wars. For over 40 distinguished years of service, General Casey, after 40 years of distinguished service, General Casey will retire from active military duty in June of 2011. General Casey is the epitome of the consummate professional, exemplifying the special qualities exhibited by all transformational military leaders: a strong sense of duty, honor, courage, and love of country. General Casey continued the tradition of military service to his country that was started by his father, Major General George W. Casey, Sr., commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, who died in a helicopter crash on July the 7th, 1970 in Vietnam. That same year, General Casey was commissioned as 2nd Lieutenant in the infantry from Georgetown University Army Reserve Officers Training Corps. He went on to excel in a variety of command and staff assignments, including notable participation in Operation Joint Endeavor in Bosnia and Operation Iraqi Freedom in Iraq. He commanded the 1st Armored Division in 1999 to 2001, served as the Director of Strategic Plans and Policy, J5, of the Joint Staff in 2001, and Director of the Joint Staff in 2003. Following these Joint Staff assignments, General Casey served as the 30th Vice Chief of Staff of the Army until June 2004. From 2004 to 2007, General Casey commanded the multinational force Iraq, a coalition of 32 countries where he oversaw the transition of 3 separate Iraqi governments. He set the conditions for transition to Iraqi-led security, which in turn enabled the successful drawdown of U.S. forces from Iraq. He was a powerful influence for democratic change in Iraq, steadily improving the security and political environment in the country, so that in 2005 Iraq was able to conduct open and transparent national elections. In April of 2007, April the 10th, General Casey became Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Since assuming this position, General Casey's leadership and commitment have contributed immeasurably to ensuring America's Army remains the preeminent military force in the world. As the Army's Chief of Staff, General Casey has provided the strategic leadership and vision to complete the most comprehensive transformation of the Army since World War II, building versatile and modular units and improving the capabilities of the soldiers to conduct full-spectrum operations. General Casey has proven himself a tremendous wartime leader, demonstrating unselfish devotion to our nation and to the soldiers he leads. Responsible for the organization, training, readiness, mobilization, and deployment of Army forces, he has worked tirelessly to successfully restore balance to the force stretched and stressed by demands of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Above all, General Casey has never wavered from his personal commitment to support the soldiers and families who are the heart and soul of the United States Army. He implemented the Army Family Covenant and the Army Community Covenant to expand and improve services and raise awareness about unique challenges military families face. Mr. Speaker, during times of uncertainty and crisis, our nation has been fortunate to have exceptional men and women who step forward and calmly lead. Such a man is General George W. Casey, Jr. He has been exemplary in his selfless service for our country through war, peace, and personal trial. It is with profound admiration and deep respect that we pay tribute to General George W. Casey, Jr. for all that he has done for the United States Army and this country. We thank General Casey, his wife Sheila, his two sons Sean and Ryan for their dedication and sacrifice on behalf of our soldiers, our Army, and our nation. And as a personal aside, I was on a plane that was grounded in Germany several years ago off Codell, coming back from the Middle East, and here comes the Commander-in-Chief of the Army jogging up to the airfield just to say hello to the congressional delegation.
The gentleman's time has expired.
He's a great man. Thank you. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At the outset, let me associate myself with the remarks of the gentleman who just spoke on General Casey and thank General Casey with him for his service to the country. Madam Speaker, in 1988, as a Republican Congress was struggling to compromise with the Democratic President on a budget bill, a member of the House rose to speak to what he called the Perfectionist Caucus. Those members who stood against compromise under any circumstances. Here's what he said. Now my fine friends who are perfectionists, each in their own world where they are petty dictators, could write a perfect bill. It would be about 2,200 of their particular projects and their particular interest and their particular goodies, taking care of their particular states. But this speaker said that's not the way life works in a free society. In a free society, he said, where we are sharing power between the legislative and executive branches, compromise is precisely the outcome we should expect to get. Those words were true then when Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House, said them, and they are still true today. In the last election, Americans voted for shared responsibility. Without both parties' willingness to compromise, however, to take less than 100% of what they want, there will be no solution to our most pressing problems, including our debt. There will be no action on our budget, and the government will be in danger of shutting down, which, in the midst of a fragile economic recovery, would be disastrous. So the question is this, Madam Speaker, who is willing to compromise and who is standing in the way? Democrats are willing to cut and compromise. We believe that smart, targeted cuts are part of the solution, and we have offered to meet Republicans more than halfway. The Republican leadership initially proposed $73 million in spending cuts. Their conference rejected that proposal and demanded $100 billion in cuts. Democrats have offered $51 billion and signaled a willingness to move toward the $70 billion figure suggested by the Republican leadership. Very near the Republicans' original goal, provided that we can agree on cuts that don't cripple our economic recovery and undermine our shared values. Cutting 200,000 children from Medicare, from Head Start is not, I believe, a value we ought to support. Adversely affecting 9 million young people's ability to go to college and make us a more competitive society is not one of those values either. Substantially reducing our ability to participate in basic research which will grow our economy, create innovative ideas, and spur invention is not one of our values. In my view, the H.R. 1 that passed this House did not represent America's values. Yes, we need to become fiscally disciplined, but we need to do it in a smart way that reflects our values. Looking at those numbers, Americans are surely thinking there is clear room to come to an agreement and keep the world's largest enterprise, the United States government, from being funded on a sporadic, uncertainty-creating 2-week or 3-week increment. So why can't we? Well, read the news. The New York Times, March 28th, said this: Tea Party supporters are coming to the Capitol this week to rally Republicans to not compromise with Democrats on spending cuts. That's the Perfectionist Caucus wing. Politico on March 27th said this, quote, harsh rhetoric Friday night suggests GOP leaders still fear a Tea Party rebellion. That's what Newt Gingrich was talking about with respect to the Perfectionist Caucus. The Hill on March 29th said, quote, striking a deal with Democrats would set off a wave of revolt among the most conservative members of the caucus. That's the Perfectionist Caucus that Newt Gingrich was talking about, that brought our government to a standstill and shut down our government in 1995 and early 96. We are in a dangerous place, I tell my friends, when compromise, which is essentially the job description of a legislator in a free society, is enough to spark revolt. Come, let us reason together, Lyndon Johnson said. That's what we need to do. We face partisan opposition to any compromise on spending levels. Some members' willingness to shut down the government unless they get their way on divisive social issues, even though the Republican pledge to America promised to, and I quote, end the practice of packaging unpopular bills with must-pass legislation to circumvent the will of the American people. In fact, Mitch Daniels, candidate for president, governor of Indiana, said they ought to be considered separately. He is right. Madam Speaker, the Perfectionist Caucus, unfortunately, seems to be alive and well. It just has a new name. Just listen to its own words. One Republican member said this: if we can't defund health care reform in the spending bill, then we have just got to dig in. In other words, shut down government if you can't repeal the health care bill. Is that an item for substantial, substantive debate? It is. But should we shut down the government while that debate is occurring? I say no. Another said, quote, I think we have to have a fight. I think this is the moment. In other words, our way or no way. I don't think that's what the American people voted for. Another said this: I don't see any room for compromise. Democracies cannot work that way. As Newt Gingrich said, we're elected from different constituencies by different people with different views, and they expect us to come here, all 435 of us and all 100 in the Senate, and make reasonable compromises to move our government forward. Yes, to reduce the deficit. We must do that, but let us do so in a way that honors our values and honors our democracy. For the rest of us, members of both parties who understand that legislating means compromise, it's time to find common ground and prevent government shutdown. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Barletta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today to share with my colleagues in the House what my neighbors at home shared with me during the past constituent work week. Throughout the week, I heard from small business owners, local officials, university leaders, teachers, students, Rotarians, and a Purple Heart National Guardsman about the issues facing Pennsylvania's 11th Congressional District. Although the voices were different, the message was the same. We need to get our economy back on track. Last week, I spoke at the Rotary Club in my hometown of Hazleton about the debt crisis crippling our nation. The Rotarians were engaged, attentive, and concerned about the spending habits of Washington. Madam Speaker, I let them know that we have a debt crisis in this country, not because Washington taxes too little, but because Washington spends too much. For far too long, the federal government has overspent, overtaxed, and overborrowed. That stops now. If we are serious about our economic prosperity, we must cut wasteful spending in favor of investments proven to work. Last week, I visited the Shine 21st Century After-School Program at Panther Valley Elementary School in Nescahoning. Located in 10 schools in Carbon and Schuylkill counties, Shine is a data-driven rural education model designed to provide academic enrichment to at-risk students. I commend Jeannie Miller, director of the Shine program, and Lehigh Carbon Community College for partnering together to benefit pre-service teachers and, more importantly, some of our region's most deserving students. Like the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, the Shine model stands out as a program that works. As a member of the House Committee on Education and Workforce, I will continue to examine how education at all levels is preparing students for careers. I was privileged last week to welcome Chairman Klein and the House Education and Workforce Committee to Wilkes University in Wilkes-Barre for a field hearing on the role of higher education in job growth and development. Witnesses from Wilkes University, Empire Beauty School, Luzerne County Community College, and Lackawanna Junior College demonstrated firsthand how Northeast Pennsylvania is taking strides to provide quality higher education. Additionally, Chairman Klein and I met with and read to a kindergarten class at Riverside Elementary East in Moosic. The reception we received from all of the students at the school was unbelievable, and I couldn't be more appreciative of the students, teachers, and school administrators for putting such a fantastic visit together. Also last week, I welcomed Chairman Mica, Subcommittee Chairman Schuster, and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to Scranton for a listening session on the future of our roads and infrastructure. The listening session helped me and other members of the committee gain a greater level of insight from local leaders with expertise and real-world experience in transportation and infrastructure policy. During the listening session, we spoke about job creation, heard some examples of burdensome regulation, listened to ideas about cost-effective maintenance plans, and were briefed on public-private partnerships as new ways to build and repair Pennsylvania's roads and bridges. Madam Speaker, the challenges we face in our district are great, but they are not unique. My friends and neighbors in Pennsylvania's 11th Congressional District are hard-working people, and I will continue to bring their voices to Washington throughout the 112th Congress. Finally, Madam Speaker, in closing, I would like to note that we're all here today free to talk and debate because of the brave men and women serving in our armed forces. I was humbled and honored this week to attend the Purple Heart Medal presentation in Hazleton to Pennsylvania Army National Guard Sergeant First Class John Leonard. Sergeant Leonard was injured in an IED explosion in Iraq in February. It is men and women like Sergeant Leonard who make me proud to be standing freely in this House chamber today. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Michoud, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak in opposition to the Korea Free Trade Agreement. The Korea FTA is fundamentally flawed. As everyone knows, it's the same NAFTA-style agreement that hasn't worked for 17 years. This agreement will further undermine U.S. manufacturing and ship more American jobs overseas. But there are things the American people don't know about this trade deal, things that the administration hopes that they will not find out. The administration will say that this agreement is key to increasing U.S. exports. But what they don't say is that it also increases Korea's imports too, which will expand our trade deficit by hundreds of millions of dollars each year and cost us 159,000 American jobs. It will also result in more underpriced goods from China being transshipped through Korea and dumped in the United States. The administration will say that this trade deal is important for the U.S. national security. But what they don't say and talk about is the potential for it to benefit North Korea through the Kaesong industrialized complex. And the administration will say that they fixed the auto provision and opened up Korea's market to all U.S. companies. But what they don't mention is the fact that they only fixed the auto provisions on paper, not in reality. And this is still a bad deal for the United States companies here in the U.S. They don't tell the American people that this free trade agreement does nothing to stop Korea's currency manipulation. But the Treasury Department actually identified Korea as a currency manipulator in their report this February. I've come to the floor today to make sure the American people are aware of how bad this trade deal is for the United States and how good this FTA is for China, Kim Jong-il, and South Korea. I would urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to oppose this flawed NAFTA-style trade deal. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise to speak out against the GOP energy agenda and the H.R. 910, the Dirty Air Act. While consumers around the nation, including my district of the Virgin Islands, are struggling to make ends meet amidst the rising cost of energy, our colleagues across the aisle are shamelessly using scare tactics to cripple EPA's regulatory authority and gut the Clean Air Act. H.R. 910, the Energy Tax Prevention Act, or more appropriately, the Dirty Air Act, will reverse generations of scientific advancement and does nothing to protect the everyday American. In fact, the legislation outright denies the science that clearly demonstrates that greenhouse gases are injurious to health and that they accelerate global warming. This is science that the Congress has paid for. The Academy of Sciences, a committee of many of the world's leading climate scientists, and others make the indisputable health link that these gases are injurious to our health. So I want to speak out against that agenda. As the President has recently said, we've got to work together to secure America's energy future. The only ones who benefit from this legislation will be those who already benefit: Wall Street oil speculators and big oil allies here in Congress. This is nothing more than polluted politics. The American people deserve better. Let's save American jobs, invest in the green economy, and ensure a clean, not a dirty future for the children of tomorrow. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu, for 5 minutes.
Yesterday, House leadership pushed through H.R. 471. I voted no because it does nothing to create jobs, hurts public education, and adds to the national deficit. We've been back to work in the House for 13 weeks, and for 13 straight weeks, the Republican majority has done nothing to create jobs. They haven't even put a single jobs bill on the House floor. In fact, their proposed spending bill actually costs America 700,000 jobs. Now, Speaker Boehner has brought his own pet project bill to the House floor that imposes his desire to privatize public education in the District of Columbia. And he doesn't even represent the district. This bill would reauthorize the failed Washington, D.C. private school voucher program and open it to new students, funneling millions in new federal spending to private schools at taxpayer expense. And yet, for the last 5 years, the voucher program has proven to be flawed and ineffective. The voucher program has not been successful in raising student academic achievement. It's had no impact on student motivation and engagement. The program has had no effect on student satisfaction with their schools or on whether students viewed their schools as safe and orderly. And voucher students were less likely to have access to important services such as programs for English language learners, programs for students with learning problems, counseling, and tutoring. Vouchers are an experiment that has been tried and has failed. This anti-education bill comes at the time when the Republican leadership is proposing drastic reductions in federal spending, including a House-passed bill slashing billions from core education programs. Vouchers are not real education reform. They don't solve problems. They ignore them. Rather than offering an empty promise for a few, we should be ensuring that every child has access to a great public school. And instead of taking money out of public school for private schools, Congress should be investing in strategies to improve school achievement. Our focus should be on strategies proven to increase student achievement, such as increasing parental involvement, strengthening teacher training, and reducing class size. And our goal should be to prepare all students for the jobs of the future, not to allow a few students and parents to choose a private school at taxpayer expense. When public schools are struggling and teachers are being laid off, the last thing we need is to spend scarce taxpayer funds on private schools. And that's exactly what this legislation would do. Speaker Boehner's bill will increase the deficit by $300 million. $300 million that could go towards making sure America's public school students and public school teachers have the resources they need to succeed. Speaker Boehner's bill offers no offsets. It's an ideological effort to recreate a program that was ended years ago because it did not work. It's time for Republicans to stop playing political games with our public education and America's economic future. And so I ask my colleagues across the aisle to join with Democrats to reduce the deficit, protect our public schools, create jobs, and strengthen the middle class. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Kaptur, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, let me ask Congress, where are you? America's trade policy is operating as if we were still in the last century instead of the 21st. Time and again, this Congress keeps failing to grasp reality and learn from past failures. Instead, Congress keeps doing more of the same failed approach. Now, this administration has pledged to soon submit another so-called free trade agreement, this time with Korea. There even are some in Congress who are demanding the President attach agreements to Panama and Colombia at the same time. All of these agreements fail to put America in a position to win economically by creating jobs here in our country. I want to remind my colleagues that these agreements are nothing more than expansions of the same failed trade policies established by NAFTA. Think about China. Ever since those agreements were signed, we've never had a single balanced trade account with those countries. These same approaches racked up another $500 billion trade deficit last year alone, and all the lost jobs across our country that were outsourced as a result. And I can assure you that our trade deficits are not getting any better as a result. Year after year, the numbers tell the same story. More job loss resulting from unbalanced trade agreements. America needs reciprocity and balance and equal access to foreign markets, not surrender. Haven't the working people of America paid a high enough price yet with the diminishment of their livelihoods, loss of home values, uprooting of their families, outsourcing of their jobs, collapsed school systems, and constant worry about a more secure future? This is a fight about who is taking away those economic opportunities drop by drop here at home and how we stop the hemorrhage. More free extremist trade agreements have given us the kind of world we inherited after NAFTA. They told us it would create millions of jobs. Instead, we've seen the manufacturing sector decimated with over 8 million lost jobs. Estimates on the number of jobs lost directly just due to NAFTA with Mexico and Canada are in the millions. Over a third of all manufacturing jobs in the United States have disappeared and been outsourced since its passage. Our trade deficit with Mexico last year alone was over $66 billion in the red. That means hundreds of thousands of pink slips in our country. And for what? The Mexican people live in greater misery while their wealthy become even wealthier since NAFTA's passage? Not a recipe for continental stability. When most favored nation status for China was rammed through here at the end of the 1990s, proponents said it would create jobs across our country. Since then, America has amassed a $2 trillion cumulative trade deficit with China. Trillion. Hundreds of thousands of more pink slips in our country, including in the so-called green energy sector. More loss of production here as China demands businesses set up shop there to do business at all and then gives vast tax holidays. And there is liberty there? No. There is communism. America and Congress, where are you? Next up, free trade extremists want us to pass more of the same. More of the same failed approach by adding Korea. In the first month of this year alone, America already had racked up $1 billion trade deficit with South Korea, and that market restricts our goods already. There is no real reciprocity. We will be lucky if we can sell 75,000 cars there under this proposed agreement. That's not going to happen because it's not guaranteed. Yet Korea already sells nearly 500,000 cars here. How is this fair? How is it reciprocal? Then there's the potential for another trade agreement with Panama. The GAO has identified Panama as a major haven for tax avoidance. In fact, Panama is one of the most popular destinations for multinational firms to create subsidiaries, many of which exist only to help them avoid paying their fair share of taxes here in our country. Why further empty out our country? Why do we do this? And finally, there is Colombia. Colombia, the most dangerous country in the world if you care about labor rights. Since the 1990s, over 2,000 trade unionists have been assassinated in Colombia, and in the vast majority of cases, there's been no justice for the victims and their families. How can America reward this? When America's trade agreements have failed so vastly and cost us millions of jobs, and we haven't had balanced trade accounts in over a quarter century, and our standard of living is headed down, we simply can't afford any more of these losing trade agreements, and we ought to go back and renegotiate the ones that aren't working for us now. It's time for a new trade model for our country that benefits our workers and our communities for a change. America simply can't afford another NAFTA that's called Korea. Madam Speaker, I yield back my remaining time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
And the House is in recess now. They will return at noon Eastern for legislative